sessions. This is what we call unplugged conversations with practitioners, alumni, and industry leaders. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming one of our own, Shaylin Castillo. Shaylin is a licensed landscape architect. Congratulations. A project manager as well at Wicken Hulse and Partners, Landscape Architecture and Planning. And I'll read her brief bio and then we'll kind of get into the details. But I'm Roberto Rivera, I'm the chair of the Landscape Architecture plus Environmental Design program, and I've known Shaylin for many years and have always been very impressed with everything that comes out of Shaylin's mind and keyboard. It's always such a pleasure to see the work and have watched you mature. So congrats. So Shaylin is a Miami native interested in urbanism and landscape. She is focused on using her interest in public spaces and its important connection to its surrounding context to create meaningful public spaces. Through her studies, travels, and professional experience, we'll talk about those, she has developed an in-depth understanding of the importance of the public realm within urban environments and strives to advance her ideas in better integrating components of sustainability, socioeconomic, and ecology into projects. So, Shaylin, welcome. You graduated in 2018, and you were a student who began as a freshman, right, at FIU. So this question is one that I always love to ask because landscape architecture, as we know, is somewhat misunderstood, a lot of times by our parents. So we spend a lot of time thinking of how we talk about what we do. So what was it about landscape architecture that interested you?
So for me, it's actually I think it's a funny story because prior to FIU, I had never actually heard of what landscape architecture was, which I think is quite common for people. And I've always had an interest in, nature and landscape itself. I think, as a kid and growing up, I always loved being outside. I always loved nature. And so when I started at FIU, I knew I wanted to be into the design field. I always was a really creative person. So I actually was signed up to be in the interiors department. So that's where I started off. But the first 2 years at FIU, as you all may know, are the formative years where they kind of blend everyone together. Well, other architecture, interior, landscape, they're all kind of mixed together. So that's when I actually found out about landscape architecture. I actually made friends with people who were in the ASLA student chapter. And then through there, I discovered what landscape architecture was. And then I also had the opportunity through the ASLA chapter to travel to New York. I don't know if you remember this trip, but it was many years ago. We were able to go.
Picture of it.
Yeah, we were able to travel with Roberto Rivera himself as well to New York City and then visit a bunch of amazing projects as well as really amazing firms where FIU alumni were working at. So I got to see the High Line in person. I got to see Central Park and learn about it in detail. So that kind of blew my mind and made me fall in love with landscape architecture, and that's kind of how I discovered it. So that's
It's amazing how, it's an intense journey, obviously, especially 5 years. We kind of remember those moments where we're so stressed in submissions, but you also remember those times when you were out of that context and you were able to, when we went to New York, I remember that trip. And we still keep in touch. Students and the professionals that we visited in all those parks. So it's as much a fond memory for you as students as it is for us as faculty. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. Tell us about the firm and how long you've been there. Give us a little bit of background about that.
Yes, so I'm currently a project manager. I work with some partners in Hollywood, and right now I'm working on kind of a variety of different project sizes and types, such as mixed-use projects, a little bit of hospitality. And I started the firm in January of last year, so I've been there just a year now, and I've really enjoyed it. And it is a much smaller firm than where I was prior to, but I think I've found that I've enjoyed that a little bit more because you get to be exposed and handle a load of different type of responsibilities. Because it's so small, everything kind of lands on you. So I've gone from drafting concepts of ideas to creating presentations to present to the client, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Is there any particular part of that process that you like to do?
I
prefer to do, you want to do more of?
I think think there's kind of two. I really love the concept point of view of it, where you know, first develop ideas and showcase it to the client and see, you know, get their feedback and, you know, have all of that. But then I also really do love when those ideas then come to life. So then doing my construction documents and the detailing of it, and then see it come to life, you know, in reality with, you know, in the built environment.
So are you doing site visits as part of your duties
Yeah.
to make sure that things get built, you know, in accordance with your design intent?
Yeah, and I think that's one side that you don't really experience as much maybe when you're in school, seeing something be built and being exposed to what a construction site looks like and how things are put together. So that's been a really big learning process, but a good one, and one that it's not difficult, but you just gotta get exposed to it.
Yeah. No, and the more you do, I think it also informs the design process, I think, because
Yes.
you realize that certain things that are very easy to model or to draw require certain negotiation with, oh, okay, how will somebody actually build this?
Yeah.
In what order? Those kinds of things. So, being Shaylin Castillo and knowing what you can do, we reached out to you and you're one of our adjunct faculty as well. So it sounds like also that runs in the family teaching. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
So it's actually been an extremely rewarding experience. So I did my first semester teaching computer practices in landscape architecture last fall, and I did it again this past fall, and I really enjoyed it. Some of my past students are here, so it's great to see them. And I found it to be so rewarding because I do love the side of the graphics, and how do you showcase your design, how do you showcase your ideas. So, you know, being able to share that and see, you know, my students also, you know, showcase different ideas and how you can communicate through graphic work has been a really rewarding process. Yeah.
And you're very good at it too. So that's why we go to Shaylin for that knowledge. So you talk a lot in your, you know, when you speak about your background, you're a Miami native and you're interested in the urban environment. So tell us a little bit about why, how did you come to love that part?
I think it mainly stems from traveling, and maybe seeing other places where the urban environment is a little bit more successful, and then being from Miami where sometimes that might lack. So I think my passion stems from there, where, you know, maybe being in a city where it's a little bit more walkable, a little bit more urban, where you can, you know, just experience public spaces. I think that's where it really stems from, and what I really enjoy, that urban design side of it.
So I'm going to ask you a trick question. I'm going to give you a magic wand, hypothetical magic wand, and you can do whatever you wanted in the urban environment in Miami. What would you do? What kinds of things would you want to change?
It's funny because one thing that really blew my mind once when I was in FIU as a student, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he worked for a city and he came and he showed us like through these 3D blocks how downtown was so, you know, built up and urban, and then Kendall down south was also built up but in a different urban way. So it was kind of showing like everyone works over here in downtown but lives over here, let's say all the way in Kendall, and it kind of just showed the issue between the disconnect of both, and how kind of that causes so much traffic between everyone traveling to work and then traveling back home. So I guess if I could do a magic wand, maybe like blending the two, where you could have a mixed use environment where you can live and work, you know, within a quarter mile and have a public park and, you know, restaurants and things like that. I think that would really help.
Yeah. So absolutely. So I think one of the things also that I think is important, especially because you're, you know, well, it's 2023, so nearing that 5-year mark in the spring for having graduated. How long have you been licensed now? When did
So
you get your?
I received my license at the end of 2021,
Okay.
which is really exciting because compared to other, I don't know, I feel like it took me a little longer, but
That's
it was
pretty good.
I guess so. I did start right after I graduated, but yeah.
So tell us about that. Obviously, landscape architecture is a professional discipline, and you can't really call yourself a landscape architect unless you're licensed. Why was that important to you? Can you talk about that process? And, you know.
Yeah. I think just like you mentioned, you know, I really had so much energy putting, you know, within my degree, 5 years working really hard to get my master's in landscape architecture, and then, you know, to then graduate and not be able to call myself a landscape architect, that might But then finally just like get back to it. So I graduated in May of 2018. I gave myself a few months, and then I took my first exam in December of 2018. So I just started right away. So
How has it changed? How has it changed what you do?
I think that's a good question because, again, through those studies of, practicing for, or studying for the exams, you learn an array of different things that you probably weren't exposed to in school, like dealing with the contractor and the bidding process and things like that. So I think that prepared me, even just having the terminology, just exposing myself to that vocabulary and this, having read something about it before, just made me feel a little more comfortable in a meeting, or if a contract came up or something like that. I think it just helps you expose yourself and feel a little bit more prepared and not, when you hear something new, you have no idea.
Right.
You're a little less intimidated by it.
I mean, in my experience, it's as much about what you actually, it is a very rigorous process, and, there's multiple steps along the way, among those being from a program that's accredited like ours, but also going through the tests. And you do absolutely acquire skills and knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily. But what it also does is it earns the respect of colleagues who are working in the professional world, where you're able to, say that you are that licensed professional like others are. And it changes the paradigm. And one little, I guess it should be more well known, but in speaking with the head of the licensing board, one of the things that they have done studies about getting licensed, and they have found that that is the one thing that equalizes, your earnings as a professional. There's a lot of disparities, like in other fields, if you are, that are gender-based, experience-based, demographically, ethnic, all those things go away once you have a license. So it's one of those things that is really important. So, it's something that students should pay attention to. I think that's a really good example of why it makes a difference and why you want to get it done. So congratulations, because 3 years is pretty darn good.
It was a long one, but thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So, so you talk also about travel and how important that is. I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about what kind of travel, why, what experiences can you point to specifically that you feel are special in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because sometimes I feel like travel really opens your eyes to new cultures, new cities, new experiences, new everything. And one in particular that I really just have found to enjoy is Europe in general. Maybe because it's, it was developed and designed in a much older time. Maybe cars weren't around, but like for example, I've been to Rome, and just being able to walk everywhere and see the different types of plazas, and the scale changes so much just for the human scale. Just enjoy it yourself. I think that's just really inspiring. And then also just looking at details as you're walking around the city, how a curb is put together, a sidewalk or a plaza, and the paving patterns, and how that all comes into play with the experience that you have in that space. I think that's something I really enjoyed to see.
Did you get a chance to do, other than the trip to New York, but did you do any study abroad?
I did. So I was able to do the study abroad to Bauhaus in Dessau, as well as Berlin and Basel in Switzerland, which was amazing. I really enjoyed it, and I still always talk about it to this day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is such a catalyst for learning. Just travel and exposure. And some of the students in the audience, we spent some time last summer. We went to Mexico City, and one of the course requirements was that observation and details, kind of deconstructing your environment and sketching it and drawing it, because we might think that we remember things, but until you draw them, they really don't sink in the same way. And also, I think the idea, you bring up Rome, talk about the millennial city and these layers upon layers of human history, things kind of sort themselves out. And you see them, and you compare that with where we are. So, I think Rome is definitely a destination to return to time and time again. Your work now, can you tell us a little bit about the types of work collaborations that you're involved with? How, you know, what are the teams, you know, and who are the people? What are the backgrounds? These are complex projects, as we see from some of the images that you've shared with us. So who's on the other side of the table when you're
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Because collaboration, I think, is a really big, important part of what we do as designers. So when I'm sitting at a table in a meeting, there's definitely always the architect. Of course, there's the client, which sometimes tends to be the developer. There's also the interior designer, as well as the civil engineers, MEP, structural. So it's kind of everyone coming together almost weekly sometimes to just check in and coordinate different projects, just to make sure that they're all working smoothly. So learning to work with others and teamwork is really important because you're going to do it forever, really.
And some of the images that you shared, you're doing things, you know, you're sketching, you're drawing. What's like a typical day or typical process? And how's that similar or different than what you did when you were with us here at FIU as a student?
I think it's similar in the way that, you know, we still come up with concepts quickly right off the bat. I do enjoy doing some hand drawing, some hand sketching. I find that it's a little bit quicker, maybe a little less intimidating, and sometimes CAD feels very, like, when you just do a line, it just feels very done, and like that's what it is. When you're sketching, you can just be a little messy and free flow a little bit more. So doing that concepts and initial ideas, that's very similar to school. But on the other hand, is then, you know, taking that into the computer eventually and giving it, or making it more realistic. So giving it dimensions of what a sidewalk width actually has to be, and taking into account what materiality the sidewalk may be, or using pavers and things like that. I think that's probably where it differs a little more, where you have to think a little bit more realistic and the materiality of it.
Actually, on the topic of travel, I mean, sketching is historically also like a very important part of documenting travel. Did you find yourself doing, I mean, how did you document your travels? Through work, through drawings, through photos, through all of the above?
I would probably say more often than not, especially just everyday life, sometimes I always have my phone. And if I see a material that I like, or some planting that looks nice, or something of the sort, I always tend to take a picture. And I try to keep it organized, especially even like at work, of like reference images of, you know, different materials or projects or things like that. I find that to be almost the quickest way. But then if you're traveling and you have a sketchbook on hand, taking the time to sit somewhere and just sketch it all out, that's also an even better way of documenting space.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're so, I think, spoiled in a way because we have the ability to document, you know, with the phone. And then it becomes a matter of organizing things, right? But you've always been a very organized, very clear, you know, person. Can you talk a little bit about your methodology? Not necessarily the specifics of how you do it, but why is that important? You know, why is this a key part of being successful?
Yeah, it's funny because when you were saying that, my past students were like nodding their head with the organization. It's funny because I almost don't think of myself as an organized person, but people tend to tell me that I'm very organized. I think I have so much in my head sometimes that I think the only way to get it all done is to just write it all down and keep everything where it needs to be, and make myself like tasks of what needs to get done, and otherwise I would be a hot mess. So I think that helps me continue to be successful, I guess, keeping everything organized and, you know.
I mean, and it comes across in the work. You know, I think oftentimes we're dealing with very complex, you know, forces, you know, conditions, players. You know, every project is different. But you know, I think, you know, whenever you do a diagram, I remember, you know, your work as being very, very clear, because it cuts through that confusion and kind of prioritizes what's the message, you know. And that is invaluable in projects that have a lot of complexity. You know, break down the big idea, you know, into something that you can actually talk about, or not even talk about actually. I mean, I think that as students, we always kind of had conversations about how you shouldn't have to talk and your work should speak for itself, you know?
Yeah, I always try to remind my students, if you put together a, a plan or a diagram and imagine that you're not there to present it, it should be able to still explain itself in some way. With, legibility, being clear, labeling, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Because you're not always going to be there sometimes, so
That's right.
being very clear with what you're presenting.
So let's go back in time. So you started in as a freshman in 2013?
2013.
2013. Okay, so that's about 10 years ago.
10 years, I know, it's scary.
Yeah. Wow, a decade. So in that, in that time, how have you? And now you're back. You come back to FIU. How do you see things differently? What has changed, or what has stayed the same?
I think the core values have stayed the same, definitely. It's definitely a lot more computer-based. Because when I started, I don't know if it's still like this, but we do everything hand drafting. You used to have those big boards with Mylar on ink, and if you messed up the whole drawing. So I think that has switched from what I've seen. So it's funny to see that, but also, just still having that energy of student is, I think that stayed the same when I see students now, and their curiosity and their excitement. I think that has continued, which is nice to see.
What can you point to as like some memories that really stand out for you in when you were at FIU? 5 years. 5 years is a lot, actually.
It's a very long time. Yeah.
Especially when you're doing an architectural, landscape architectural education. So what were the highs and the lows? What do you remember the most, other than the awesome trip to New York?
I feel like I could start with the low. Something quickly came to my mind. So right at the beginning, I don't know if they still do this, but it was the Cube project where you're learning to just design space in general. My mom might laugh because I had a breakdown that first week. And it was putting together a cube using, for the lack of a better word, like little sticks, like little wooden sticks, and then cutting board, and also just thinking back to using the wrong materials to do that and cutting myself in the middle of the night. So that was probably like a low, and I think the high was probably presenting my thesis presentation. I think that was a really good moment because you work so hard for something and you finally get to present it. So I think that was a.
So tell us a little bit about that. I remember the drawings like still, and you had you had these drawings about I think at the time you were looking at security and terrorism and how do you create public space that understood those constraints. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my thesis was how to protect public spaces from physical acts of terrorism. And it was almost trying to think creatively, where, unfortunately these events do happen to public spaces, and those are spaces that are targeted. So it's just thinking of different ways to come up with different systems of how to protect, a park or a plaza while still not, making it a space that feels like it's so full of security for the user, but it's still enjoyable. So how do you hide these different security measures within the landscape, and that also could enhance the landscape? So that was kind of my thesis project.
And what are there any lessons, things that you picked up that you kind of go back to? Oh, I remember I did that as part of my education. Things that I don't know, conversations or strategies, or I don't know, things that you to this day might remember. Oh, that kind of was like an interesting turn of how you might have done something one way, but you did it differently.
Yeah, I think having Giano, he loved using precedent studies. So that's probably something that I still use now to develop ideas, just looking at how other projects are done, and taking into account, what is already out there. Sometimes you don't have to think that hard and think so far outside the box. Maybe just looking at other examples, I find that still really helps. I think that's probably the main thing that I could.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, and I think also it's a benefit that so much is documented, you know, these days. I mean, in this resource we talk about it. I'm very involved with the Landscape Architecture Foundation. This year I happen to be president, but one of the things that the LAF does is those performance studies and case studies. And there's a wealth of information there that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, like you said. You go, you show it, and those resources weren't there. Clearly when I was around as a student. But you know, it's true, like you learn so much just by looking at how things have been solved before, and that gives you a chance to kind of innovate.
Yeah, I think also, so you mentioned seeing something was solved before just helps you maybe answer some of your questions. Then again, think you maybe a little bit more creatively. How could this be different? How could it be a little bit more modern or fit into our times? Where there might be projects that are extremely old, but there's still things you can take from it, and then you just can innovate it.
Yeah. So clearly we have students in the audience, and they are doing the journey that you did, you know, some years ago. So that gives us a chance to ask, you know, what you think you might do differently, what you think you would have done if you were to be doing your education again. So tell us a little bit about that. Reflect on that for us.
Yeah, I think as a student, one thing that I remember is that everyone kind of took hard was, you know, you work so hard on your midterm presentation or your final, and then you sit up there for 2 minutes and you present it, and then you get feedback. Sometimes it could be just be crushing the things that you hear. So I think it's just learning to take feedback, and that it's constructive, and in a way it's just gonna make you better, and you know, always take that feedback in, absorb it, and see what you can learn from it. Because I found that even in the real world, constantly a design is almost never done. The client's gonna constantly give you feedback, want to change things and tweak things. So if you're too married to something, you're too in love with it, and they want to completely switch it, you're gonna be heartbroken. So I think it's just being open to feedback, and being flexible, and
Yeah.
you know, to work with that.
That's so true. I mean, I think that having confidence in the fact that an idea can always be better speaks to what you're talking about. And in a way, it's a way to also be resilient if you don't get so attached
Yeah.
to something that you've spent so much energy on. But recognizing that, I agree. I mean, as a student, as a professional, that has so much potential for you to kind of develop the skills that no matter what happens, you're going to be ready.
Right. Absolutely. Because there'll be times that you have a whole design, and the client comes or the architect comes and says, we need to put, you know, a new ramp there, and a whole portion needs to be like wiped out for that huge ramp. But it's just being flexible and saying that's fine. We'll rearrange, and you have to constantly do like a back and forth between the architect and everyone else you're working with. So you just have to be, you know, open and flexible to that.
And when you were, I mean, I think as a student, inevitably you do teamwork, you collaborate, and we still obviously do that. We do that in school now. We do that as professionals. What are maybe some guiding thoughts about how to work effectively in a team?
Yeah, if I wasn't gonna say the feedback, I would have said teamwork is another important one as a student, because I think as a student, it's so much easier to just do your own projects, and you kind of struggle doing teamwork ones. But it's just being open and being able to communicate clearly with someone, and also sometimes you have to find the right group. Sometimes not always chosen, but just learning who you work better with. That's completely normal. And from personal experience, I did find that myself. And then once you have a good group, it's just being able to collaborate and communicate and organize everything together. You know, just to work as a team. Because in the end, you'll never be just you on your own. You have to always work with someone else.
That's right. Yeah. What are you looking forward to? Like, what's on the horizon in your career now?
It's funny because towards the end of last year, I would say that I got promoted to project manager, so that was a big goal of mine, which is exciting. And I think right now I'm just really enjoying getting into the construction side process. So I have a few projects coming into construction now, so I'm really looking forward to being exposed to, you know, being on construction and overseeing that portion of it.
important has being a Miami native been to who you are today?
It's funny because now I almost seem like if you're from Miami, it's almost rare. I almost don't really meet many people anymore when they hear that I'm from Miami. They're like, "Oh wow, really?" So I think I've been here so long, obviously my entire life, but I'm so familiar with the climate. I'm so familiar with the plant palette, and I think that really helps me maybe understand what will work better, like working with plants, for example, in the plant species selection. Some people really want to put some random plants that might not work or a tree. So I think having that exposure and already that experience has helped me working in South Florida.
What are some of your favorite places or spaces in Miami?
One that I do love, that always comes to mind, is actually South Point Park. I really do love the design of it. I think it was done by Shaylin and how they just used, mounding and just a little bit of topography to really, create new vantage points of the views of the ocean, the views of the city, as the cruises are leaving the terminal. I think that's one space that I really enjoy. You can bike, you can walk, and also seeing others enjoy the spaces as well. You always see families. So I think that's one that I really enjoy.
So that's like more of a large scale urban park. Are there other, like, the urban fabric obviously has so much variety to it.
Yeah.
Are there other spaces that you think about often when you're designing?
Yes. One would be one that I've always loved is Lincoln Road or Espanola Way. I think the human scale within it just feels really comfortable to just walk. You can tell everyone's just enjoying the space. And then it's just pedestrian oriented. That's something I really value as well in the space.
Yeah. And so, I mean, as a landscape architect, I think we are always designing for multiple audiences. And the spaces that you mentioned, they provide different types of environments for, being out in the open and having a vantage point. Part of it too, and you mentioned like, the native palette and all that. How does designing for not just human beings, but like ecologies, how do you think of integrating that in your work, the natural environment?
I think, as you mentioned, kind of not always sticking with a native palette, but always taking that into account when you're designing and selecting the plant species, because I think in the end, the native species will typically, be the most resilient in the environment. They'll attract what's native to the area, whether it's birds or insects or that sort of thing. So always keep taking that into account. And I think also just enjoying what is native to our state is also really beautiful in its own way, and it's really unique as well. So
Yeah, it's so rich. So I'd like to open up the floor to maybe some students to ask questions, and then we'll do rapid fire questions after that. So to the students in the audience, do you have questions for Shaylin?
I know that when Roberto asked if there were anything that you wished you were exposed while you were a student, I know you mentioned dealing with contractors and being exposed to contracts. Is there anything else that you think was missing as you were, in that transition, like when you started professional life?
yeah, I think that's a good question. Because I think nothing will prepare you entirely for going out into the field. But one thing is, we learn our species of plants in school. And we can see a plant, we can name it, botanical name, and scientific name, and common name. But then also think just seeing what plants work well together when you're doing a planting plan, and when you're designing what a bed of a landscape might look like. So what plants might work well together, and kind of exposing yourself, just going out, and just when you walk around or travel, maybe even taking pictures of when you see a landscaping, different plant palettes put together, and if you think that it looks well, maybe document it, and just getting used to that of designing and planting as well. Because we're so, I think, in our head sometimes of urban, just a lot of hardscape sometimes, and we don't really think of the species itself, the plants that we're going to use. So I think take into account how that can complement space.
And always thinking critically, like you said, when you're out there, I would have done this differently. Sometimes it's a little stressful,
Yeah.
and people around us don't appreciate when we're observing how things could be better. But
Yeah. Yeah, I get
but
that.
it is the true mark of a landscape architect.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes. Is there any trends that you're seeing in the career happening more and more that we as students should be looking into to be more prepared in the future once we are professionals?
Do you mean trends as in like styles or like in design?
In general, or whatever
Okay.
comes to
So
you
one
first.
that does come to mind, and I feel like I'm seeing it so much now, is using like a native plant palette, like very heavily, kind of steering away from more very those tropical, a lot of philodendrons and big leafy things. I've noticed like a lot of they're using slash pines a lot, kuntis, like saw palmetto, and like those they call them character palms, which are
Yes.
kind of cabbage
Same.
palms, yeah, that are curved. So I've seen that come into play a lot, and in the office we are starting to use that palette a lot more. So I feel like maybe that's a style that's in right now. And I was wondering, I wonder if it's gonna go out eventually. So it's funny to see it right now like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it has advantages because it's acclimated and the resources to maintain it. Because it is native, you don't need as many resources. But it's like anything, I mean, in design or art, it's always a pendulum,
Yeah.
right? We go from one end to the other and find ourselves sort of wondering when it might change, but it just happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true though. Other questions?
When you working as a project manager, how many do you give the client a certain amount of revisions?
That's a good question. So typically, you know, the higher ups in my office, for example, they'll put together a contract. Well, to my understanding, there isn't a limit of revisions. Because we have a clientele that we're used to working with regularly, and a set deadline that when we need something by, we'll get revisions at the time that we make a submission. We'll get revisions, we'll make them, and then we'll submit it again. So typically, since it's a timeline, we kind of just follow that timeline and have a set deadline goal, where there isn't really a per se number of revision limit, but we just make sure that we meet our deadlines in a way that makes sense. So, and I think that the client just knows that as well. Like they, like 50% way through like construction documents, I don't think they'll come and say, let's change this whole design. I think they know as well the process of when everything is needed and when to make a major change like that.
Yeah.
So I would assume that the majority of your clients are like developers or property managers, or like property owners, not like residential owners, but more like commercial.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, my office, we do very few residential homes. It's very far field between. We do a lot of big commercial projects, like you mentioned. So a lot of the clients are developers who have, you know, big portfolios of large projects that they're all working on, and then we work directly with the project manager for those developers, and that's kind of how the project is structured.
I mean, you mentioned something that I think is an important thing to highlight, and that is that your clientele seems to have a lot of, you know, clients that come back to you for work. And that generally, I mean, that's obviously a very good sign because they're happy with what you're doing. But it also helps to understand the expectations, and, you know, once a client understands what you do, then it's a really symbiotic relationship because, you know, you kind of build on that expectation, you can innovate, and they trust you. So trust is, I think, fundamental to a really strong client relationship, and that obviously shows up if they come back to you for work.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, so Andy Ricken, who's the CEO, president of our firm, he's very big on, you know, building those relationships, particularly with clients, and he's had clients who've been with us for 30 years, he tells me. So it's impressive to see how that relationship stays, and, you know, you're working together within Ethical, and in the end, you might get a client who maybe might not be the nicest, but in the end, you have to remember, you know, you want to make them happy. You all have the same end goal, so you just, you know, try to work hand in hand on getting the project done and, you know, achieving what's needed.
Yeah, and And a good part of that is also just being able to anticipate what the client is going to ask you, what they will want. I mean, that is so important. I think the more experience, and somebody like Andy, who's one of the greatest people on earth, he's been doing this for a long time. I mean, he understands those kind of like that standard and what what the projects require. And besides, I don't think anybody could ever get mad at Andy. Great. Other questions from the floor?
Well, yeah, one more.
Yeah, go for it.
In the process of getting your license, what do you think it was the hardest part?
If I'm honest, studying. Because it's so easy once you graduate. You're so used to staying up late and working on your projects. Once you graduate, you have this big weight off your shoulders where it's like, oh, now I have time to go out and watch a movie or watch Netflix. So I think dedicating yourself to studying. So finding what works best for you. I think everyone's different. So for example, I'm a morning person. So the way that I organize my day is that I would get up at like 5 a.m. and take like an hour before starting to get ready for work to read, to take practice quizzes and things like that. And then I would also fit in maybe like an hour during my lunch hour at work. I would also study then. But then after work, I wouldn't typically study just because I was exhausted from being at work all day. So just finding, I guess, what works best for you, and fitting that in and being diligent about it.
Yeah.
That's,
I mean, the one thing that I will say is that life will only get more complicated the longer that you wait. So Shaylin did a really good thing. Front load it as much as you can because, commitments, I mean, it's not a bad thing, but just life has this tendency. You will always add more and more. It's very rare to kind of get rid of responsibilities and things like that. And that's one of those things you put your head down, like you said, make yourself be disciplined, create a schedule, and don't think about it. You just gotta jump into it. Don't should I? No, do it, and then afterwards you can kind of decide whether it was the right thing to do or not.
That's a good point, because even I was thinking about it recently. I was like, I don't know if I could study right now, like how I studied then. So I'm so happy I did it right when I graduated. Because I think right when you graduated, you're still kind of in that groove of having to work for something and constantly having something to do. I think I would recommend just starting right off the bat. You won't regret it.
Taking notes.
That's right. That's right. Other questions? Now's the time.
Which one was the hardest section?
So, it took me 3 years to get my license. I have friends that did it all in a year. So it took me a little longer. I don't know which one was the hardest because, like I said, it took me a little long. I took each one, except for the last one, multiple times. So I don't know if I could say which one is the hardest. The last one, I took it, I finished it in one go, which I was shocked about, because I heard that one's the toughest. I don't know, maybe the construction one?
The construction.
So, all right. So I'm going to ask you take us to that moment when you got word that you had passed that last section. What was that? What was that?
So, many of you might know Dominic, my boyfriend. So we basically did it all together and would study together, and having like that buddy system really helped. So sometimes he would pass or I wouldn't pass, or I would pass and he wouldn't. So that was kind of hard. So for the last exam, we finally found out. He checked first. I did not want to check. And he passed. I was like, oh gosh, how can I check now? What if I failed? But thankfully we both passed together. So that was.
Oh, that's awesome.
It was so exciting and really emotional too, because you worked so hard for something.
Yeah.
So it was so sweet. Yeah.
Back in my day, you used to get a letter in the mail. You couldn't check
gosh.
online. So that was, I remember opening that and, feeling relieved.
Oh my gosh.
What did you do right after? Did you go anywhere, celebrate
Yeah,
anywhere?
so we were actually on vacation already. We were in Cape May, New Jersey, with some family members, and we were able to check there. So it would have been the the end of a bad trip. We were found out. So I didn't know the high.
That's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So I think it's time for some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So if budget and timing weren't a problem, where would you travel next?
Japan. I would love to go to Japan.
And why?
I feel like the list could be so long as to why. One, the culture just seems so fascinating. The food, the architecture, the huge, massive cities. That seem like they just seem so captivating and so well designed as well. I think yeah, it would have to be Japan.
Well, it's funny you should say that. Because we started this last year. I got approval to have alumni participate in study abroad.
Oh boy.
And the study abroad in Summer B, which is the first week of July, first 10 days of July, is going to be to Japan. And so it's open to alumni, and it's very, very straightforward. So it would be amazing if you and Dom could join us. So I'll send you the details.
I'm there.
Pack my bag.
Before COVID, obviously, I did a study abroad with students from the School of Architecture, and I had lived in Japan like 3 years in a former life. It feels, and it's true. I mean, it's everything about it has so many lessons: design lessons, art lessons, cultural lessons. It's like a very dense, book, that you just being there, you absorb so much,
Yeah.
and it helps everything that we do, I think. So I'm looking forward to that trip. Shaylin. All right. Favorite meal. What is your favorite meal?
Favorite meal as or favorite food?
It's fine, either one.
I love Greek food.
Okay.
So if I had to pick a favorite meal or food, I love like grilled octopus and like a Greek salad or things like that.
We don't get sponsors for this spring sessions, but where do you go for the best grilled octopus if you were to have
That's a
it?
good question because there's an amazing place in Fort Lauderdale called the Greek Isles.
Okay.
So it's right off of US 1, just passing, I think, Oakland.
Okay.
And it's amazing, so I would really recommend it.
Okay.
They don't take reservations, and there's always a line, but it moves really quickly, and I would definitely recommend it.
The Greek Isle?
The Greek Isles, yeah.
The Greek Isles, okay. In Miami, there's Old Lisbon Restaurant in South Miami, which is pretty
Is
spectacular.
that the one for away?
That's the one on Sunset, close to,
Yeah.
well, check it
Someone
out.
else would consider,
It's
yeah.
good. There's one on Crow Way too. They're the same, I think the same company, but either one.
Nice.
Either one is good. Now I'm hungry. In Japan, you have, tacos, which is octopus. You will have the ability to partake in good cooking there too. All right. So, what is your favorite sound? We're always so obsessed with visual things in landscape architecture. So I added, what is your favorite sound to kind of shift that paradigm a little bit?
That's a weird one.
But it's very important.
Okay.
We'll talk about it, but tell me.
I feel like the first thing that came to my mind was the sound of like water.
Mm-hmm.
So like trickling water. I think that just sounds most relaxing. So maybe that's my favorite sound.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like, so, obviously when we're designing spaces that every sense is affected, we just often, I think in our field, we obsess over the visual, and rightfully so. It's, there's so much information we gather that way, but hearing, smelling something, there's spaces that just have a particular sound that are, that you remember, or the way that something smells, or the way that, and it just kind of makes you, I mean, it's not something that we necessarily design for, but it's always something that I ask our guests to see what they're thinking about. Any particular place, the sound of water generally, but any fountain or any place that any fountain in Rome that you're fond of?
I don't think any fountain in Rome, but I feel like I have this view of like a waterfall
Mm-hmm.
and the sound of trickling water.
Yeah.
Somewhere very
So, yes, we know that you're a landscape architect and you have been studying and doing this for a long time now, 10 years now. What are some non-landscape related things that you enjoy doing?
So I love cooking. I also love baking. That's probably what I spend my time outside of work doing. Or if I want to try to relax, that's something I'll do. And then I also just love spending time with my family and my two boogaboos.
How old are they?
One is about to turn 4, which is crazy. I can't believe it, in July. And then the other one's 2, which is the crazy one.
We all have one. That's
He's
great.
1.5. He's 1.5.
Yeah. All right. What about what music do you consider to be favorite or musical genre or an artist or something like that?
I always say I don't really have good taste in music. I don't know.
How important is music? Going back to sound,
That's funny because I typically will find myself like playing music while I'm working. But I'll just admit I just love some Taylor Swift.
For good reason. Let's
Yeah.
let's do. That's great. All right. What about obviously art is very much related to visual art as all other kinds of art, obviously to what we do. But do you have a favorite visual artist or any other kind of artist for that matter?
Yeah. One that I always seem to love, especially when I see it in the museum, I'm like mesmerized by it, is Monet paintings. I think they're so beautiful. The blending of colors. When you're up close, it looks abstract. When you step back, you see, the whole visual. So that's one that I really love.
Have you been to Paris?
Yes.
Have you been to the Tuileries? Have you stood in the middle of that gallery?
Yes.
Felt like you're floating
Yeah.
in the middle of the lilies?
Yeah, it's amazing.
It is amazing. I am with you 100%. It was life changing. I had a chance to live in Paris. I would always go back there because you feel like you're standing in that one room and you're surrounded. It's like an oval shaped room, and you feel like you're floating in the water. So yeah, it's a good one. Okay, and do you have anything on a reading list or an audiobook that's not landscape related?
I do. I have yet to get to it, but right before the holidays, Andy, my boss, gave me a book on setting goals and achieving goals.
Good old Andy.
Yeah, so that's on my list right now to read. I have yet to get to it, but I should get to it soon.
Yeah, I love Andy because Andy is always thinking of how to, in the time that I've known him, he's always thinking how to grow, how to help people grow, and he's always been very supportive of our alumni, and yeah, it's great. So setting goals.
Yeah, every time you leave his office, you'll leave with like a PDF, like a scan of a book that he'll give somebody constantly. So he's always sharing the knowledge with everyone.
Definitely. All right, so then one more question. It's a pretty intense career, what do you do to disconnect?
That's a good one because it's similar to school. It can be stressful at times. So learning to, I guess one way for me is when I leave work, I try to tell myself, like doors close and it'll be there tomorrow, and the world will keep spinning. So when I get home, I just try to focus on other things that I enjoy myself and other hobbies on the outside. So whether it's exercising or spending time with family or baking or cooking, I think that helps me disconnect then.
What's your favorite thing to bake?
The last thing I did was some, what's it called? Brown butter chocolate chip cookies. Which was really good, yeah.
Very nice. All right. Well, we now have a menu to go with the talk. And I want to thank Shaylin. Give Shaylin a big round of applause. And thanks for joining us for a spring session, the first one for the semester.
Thank you. Great
All
honor.
right.